Today we've got a very interesting subject, I believe. It's a very complex subject. It's a very deep subject, and I'm going to have to cut an awful lot of corners, and I apologize already for what I'm going to have to leave out. I'm going to talk to you today about Deathwind. But before I can talk to you about Deathwind, the most successful Indian fighter in Virginia, I'll have to give you a little of the background. Our acquaintance with the Indians is not exactly that the establishment gives us. We don't think of the Indian as standing on a hill with tears running down his cheeks, looking at the beer cans on the side of the road. The main reason is that our experience with the Indians occurred when they didn't have cars or beer cans. That's one reason. And the second is, well, let me give you an example. A ship was coming into Jamestown. Now, you know how it is. The river, James River, runs from east to west. All winds are westerly. They come from the west to the east. And you have to wait until the winds change before you can take a ship and go up the river to Jamestown Island, about 20, 30 miles on up the river. So you wait there behind a little point of land until the wind changes. And that is, Captain Newport is the one who used to bring the supplies and the mail to Jamestown Island. And sometimes he had to wait down there 4 or 5 days, sometimes 2 weeks for the winds to change. So they would send a boat down there to pick up his Captain Newport's news. And that's point of land that he was anchored at is known today as Newport News. That's where it gets its name, in case you're interested in a little trivia like that. To me, I find that just absolutely fascinating, and I know you could care less. But anyway, the wind changed. The ship was coming in from England, and they turned the bend in the river into James, and there was Jamestown Island right up ahead. And out from behind Jamestown Island came a canoe, and it was rowed by 7 Indian children and an Indian squaw in the back, and they were rowing, they were paddling just as fast as they could. And that canoe, you know how those are built. They're just as light as a feather. It's easy enough for a strong man to hold a canoe out with one arm. And you can really make those canoes move, or those birch bark canoes really move, and that was really moving. But right behind that birch bark canoe came a ship's whaleboat, and it was rowed by English sailors, and they were rowing for all they were worth. And I don't care how fast that canoe was going, that whaleboat was coming up, and it was overtaking the canoe. And the Indian squaw would turn back and in desperation and fear, and she would paddle it all the harder and scream at the children to make them paddling. And right up under the bows of the ship, the whaleboat finally caught up with them and ran up over the top of the canoe and forced it under the water. And the coxswain leaned over with a pistol and put it up against the Indian squaw and blew her brains out right there. And all the rest of the crew members took their paddles and held the Indian children under the water until they drowned. And everybody on the ship was shocked, absolutely shocked. They were told back in England how the colonists were persecuting these Indians, these poor Christian Indians, newly converted Indians. And here was absolute proof of what they were doing. And they arrived at Jamestown Island enraged over what they had just seen. And they landed, and then they heard the rest of the story. It seems that the Indians had a god. His name was Oki. Now, Oki was seen in the thunder and the lightning. And Oki had special demands. Oki ate pain. He had to have pain, and he fed on pain. And if he did not get pain to eat, he would require it of that individual Indian. So the Indian had an incentive to go out and find a source of pain to feed Oki. Now, it was easy to get an animal and inflict pain on the animal, but that's rather mundane. Another Indian? Well, Indians were right tough. And they made a special point of never saying anything or making a noise under torture. So you never knew exactly how much pain Okie was really getting when you tortured an Indian. However, when you came across a white man and you stuck fire to his toes and you pulled the skin off and strips off of his leg and stuck matchsticks in it and lit them one at a time, he came out with the most satisfying noises. You knew he was hurting, you know? You could hear him from a long way off. Now, a white man was very much prized by the Indians. And they would keep a white man and they would treat him well. And they would fatten him up, and they would get him in the very best of condition to withstand what was to come. And when he was in his prime, everyone was friendly to him. There was nothing personal in this. I hope you understand. When he was in his prime, he would be led out to a stake and tied. And the women and children who were trained to this would be turned loose on him. Now, I'm not going to go into graphic details of what was done on him. I'm just going to touch the surface, and your imagination is going to have to take up where I leave off. First, his eyelids would be removed. Now, I don't know how many of you have been forced to keep your eyes open for several hours, but that is not a minor discomfort. It becomes very major after 4 or 5 hours. The Arabs have learned to do this in the past. And then after a day's time, that alone is a shrieking source of pain that's indescribable, that nobody here knows what has happened because they've never talked to anyone that this has been done to. Then, as I said, they would gradually move the skin. Of course, it goes without saying the toenails and the fingernails, they go slowly. Then the toothpicks in the skin until you are one big charred piece of flesh. And then your private parts will be removed slowly. And then your tongue and your lips will be removed, and your cheeks, and all the skin from your face. And then your intestines, slowly. And then after 3 days, you are one shrieking piece of quivering flesh, just what Okie craves. One white man, and especially a priest, because they found the priest did far better than an average settler, would satisfy Okie for a long time. And often, white men would disappear with no trace. And no one ever found out what happened to them. But they found 2 white men ashore, not far from where Williamsburg now stands, that had been subjected to the tortures needed to bring out that pain that Okie craved. Now, this is what they found when they discovered these white men. These 7 children and the squaw were the ones administering the tortures. They were the ones paddling the canoe. And after the people on the boat found that thing out on the ship arriving and had heard the rest of the story, then all of a sudden the stories they had been told back in England about the noble red savage didn't quite ring true. They had a problem. The problem was if they wandered around in the woods near Jamestown Island, they might have a very definite problem. You see, they became involved themselves. Things assumed a different perspective. The Indians, if they did not have white men, white priests, or white men, they would take their own children and subject them to this, to get this torture. Now, this is the worship of Oki. Oki is called different names in different parts of America. He is called different names in this part. But our grandfathers who came into the Colorado regions and the Montana regions were subjected to the same tortures that our people in Virginia received from the very same God in the very same way. Now, all of these people and all of these Indians in Virginia were Christians. They had all been converted, and they came to worship service, and they found out they could get all sorts of things, presents, by coming. And they sang hymns to sweet Jesus, loving Jesus. Jesus was good. Jesus was kind. Jesus looked after you. Oki, he was mean. He was tough. You had really better look out for Oki. Jesus was okay now, but look out for Oki because he meant business, you see. Now, if you were an Indian and you had a choice between following somebody who was good, who was sweet, who would take care of you, who looked after you and was kind to you, and somebody who was mean as a devil, who would take the hide off your back, and if he didn't get that pain, he would certainly do to it. Now, if you were an Indian, now who would you pay attention to? Now, that was the situation they were in. The Indian is not a sunburned white man. The law created us. We are made by the law. Every murderer for 1,000 generations among our people has been taken out and killed. Every rapist, everyone deserving of capital punishment has been taken out, and the punishment prescribed by God's law has been administered. The result is 1,000 generations of selective breeding. When you look and see another Israelite coming down the road, you are seeing something that God created. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. We are the product of the law, God's law. The Indian is also a product of his law. The way an Indian gets a wife is he either fights for her or he buys her. And women are chattel in the Indian nation, in Virginia. If you were a chief, you killed many men, and then you had many wives. If you were a good horse thief, you could steal many horses and buy many wives and have many children. The children of Indians in Virginia were descended from horse thieves and murderers. For 1,000 generations they were that way. You can go to the prisons down there in that part of the country, and they would be filled with Indians doing what is natural. Now, that's not to say our people don't have horse thieves. Our people certainly do. But we don't make them kings. We take them out and hang them from the nearest tree. Now, that makes a whale of a lot of difference. It's a question of selective breeding. The news paints us as being fierce, as being inhuman, as being oppressors of all people. That's what the media says. The fact is, among all the peoples of the world, who are the most gentle? Who are the most forgiving? It is almost impossible to take one of our people and make him kill someone else. He will find any excuse not to kill him. Training men in the service to kill their opponents is a difficult thing. It can be done. You can train our people to anything, but it's tough. We are the product of 1,000 generations. They are a product of 1,000 generations. Down in Virginia, Captain John Smith, who brought the settlement and saved it, he made this observation, that all the Indian villages consisted of 6 or 7 women and children for every man. There would be 5, 6 squaws for every brave, and a whole flock of children, and very few men. What happened to the men? They were dead. Why were they dead? They died in combat. It was a process of selective breeding. Each brave had sometimes 10, 15 wives. The situation was entirely different. Today, you go on our Virginia reservations and look around, and how many Indian women do you see for each brave, for each Indian male? You see 5, 6, or 7. The same percentages today as they had back there 400 years ago. You go on your reservations in the West right now. Now, I haven't been on the reservations in 40 years. And now the ones I went on were Washington State. But when I was there, you had 6, 7, or 8 women for every man. Now, where are all the men? I don't know. Down on our Virginia reservations, they say they leave the reservations and go off working somewhere and never, ever come back. We have always had a sneaking suspicion that something happened to them and they dropped them in the dismal swamp and you'll never find them. Now, that's what we believe. But it's very interesting how nothing has changed. And the God they worship today is called Jesus. But a man told me, who was on one of these Indian reservations as a government employee, how he watched a cow giving birth, and the calf was hung. And the cow was in extreme pain, and the Indian was sitting on the porch watching him. And he said, "Hey, you better help that cow." And he nodded, and he drove on off. When he came back 6 hours later, the Indian was still sitting in the chair, and the cow was down on the ground, almost dead. Why? Neglect? Not hardly. It sounds like to me, Okie is alive and well. Now, that for a background, we progress on. In Virginia, we had a governor named Berkeley. Berkeley had a monopoly from the king. Half of the entire income of the colony went to the governor, 2,000 pounds per year as his salary. But in addition, he had a monopoly on all the trade with the Indians, which meant all the fur trade. Now, you know about beaver hats. You know about furs and the love of them. He had a monopoly on all Virginia furs. In other words, the 2,000 pounds a year, which was a royal ransom, was peanuts compared with what he was getting from the fur trade. And what does the rule say about trading with strangers? Thou shalt not strike thy hand with strangers, you're not to deal with them. And he did. The Indians still had a need to furnish Okie with proper sacrifices. And they were constantly dropping down on the frontiers and picking up individuals to feed Okie. And Governor Berkeley did nothing, because to do nothing, it would interrupt his trade with the Indians. And finally, things got bad. And at the falls of the James, the fall line, how many know what the fall line is? Oh, good. We got some, but I better explain. Around in Virginia, we've got these great big rivers, and you can take the biggest ships that you ever saw way inland until they hit the fall line. Fredericksburg at one place, Washington, D.C. is another place on the Potomac. The cities are built on the fall lines where you can't go any further. Richmond's built on the fall line where it comes down. Now, what happened, we had a settler named Bacon. He went in and he settled a plantation there at the fall line at Richmond. The Indians came down and they took his workers, his overseers, and some of his family and sacrificed them to Okie. So he called the militia and they went out after the Indians. Governor Berkeley came down on him for doing that, for interrupting his trade. And it resulted in a war called Bacon's Rebellion. If Governor Berkeley had been taken care of, or had been retired, or recalled to England, or something had happened to him, it would have saved a war in which hundreds and thousands of people in Virginia died. My grandfather served with Bacon, and we had all of our lands confiscated as a consequence. Now, there were war crime trials held right after. Everyone who served with Bacon was either confiscated or hanged, and the hangman was busy in Virginia, and it's so often they hang the prisoners slowly. I don't have time to go into that, but that is a particular part of history you should be very familiar with. 100 years before the Revolutionary War, there was a revolution in Virginia. It was called Bacon's Rebellion. And while the Revolutionary War is big to many people in other parts of the country, Bacon's Rebellion is big to us. We know where the battles were fought. We know where the armies were stationed. We know what happened and the maneuvers made and so forth. We live on that land. And we know where the land was my grandfather owned that was confiscated and turned over to a follower of Bacon. This goes on, and Virginia kept pushing the Indians west. Now, you have to understand something about the Indians. If you're going to fight an opponent, you had better understand the laws they operate under. If you go against the Indians and don't know that they have a god and that his name is Oki, you are at a disadvantage. Further, you ought to know their system of land ownership. Indian land ownership is this: as long as they are on that land, it is theirs. When they leave that land, they have a 1-year period, grace period, in which to reoccupy that land. If they do not, it's up for grabs, under condition that the person who grabs it can hold it. That means he must be a good warrior and a good fighter, but that's the Indian rule. You've heard of how the colonists really ripped the Indians off in buying Manhattan Island for a few beads. What is it, $23 worth of beads? The Indians hadn't lived on Manhattan Island for 2 years. And they still sold Manhattan Island for $23 worth of beads. Now, who got ripped off? You have to understand the law under which you're working, you see, and operating under. And it was very well understood on the frontier. Especially the fact that the colonists on the frontier had enemies behind who would not support them and fierce enemies in front. The great bone of contention was the Ohio Territory. Now, this was a gigantic area, rich beyond belief, right over the Ohio River. And when George Washington went up to form a fort where the two rivers come together, Monongahela and they found the French had arrived there before them, and there was a fight. And that was the beginning. It was the beginning of what is called the 7 Years' War. But we did not call it the 7 Years' War. We called it the French and Indian War for a reason. Everywhere else in the world, it's called the 7 Years' War. In America, it's called the French and Indian War to commemorate an atrocity. The atrocity is this, that the French made common alliance with the enemies, their Indian allies, to fight their enemies, the English. Now, this is absolutely forbidden by Scripture. And that's why the war was named French and Indian War, to commemorate for all time the contempt that the English and the Americans held for the French, who would make an alliance with the Indians. Remember, the Indian and the French war parties went out together, the French soldiers and the Indians, and under only one condition, that the French soldiers allowed the Indian allies to offer their sacrifices to Oki within the view of the French soldiers. And the French soldiers were ordered to put up with any atrocities the Indians committed for the sake of their alliance. The French were using the Indians, and this was considered just an awful, awful thing by the people it was being done to, namely our ancestors who were on the border. Now, I want to briefly go into the type of warfare. The English sent a general over here, a very brave general, a very successful one. His name was Braddock. And Braddock had a couple of regiments of regulars. And he augmented these regiments with, I'm not sure where the rest of his men came from, but I do know they called up the Virginia militia. Now, Braddock was a product of the Continental Wars. And that day and time, that machine that he operated was a fantastic machine, a war machine. They fought in 3 lines. Their weapons were muskets. They weren't rifle muskets, just muskets. A man was trained to load and fire. Didn't even have sights. A 1-ounce ball. And he, a skilled musketeer, could load and fire 5 times a minute. In actual combat, 3 times a minute. The line would present. A sergeant at the end of the line could look down, number 46, raise number 18, lower, and then he would say fire. And anything in front was in trouble. When that mass of lead spewed out, it chopped down lines in front just like cordwood. It was a thing, it was just unbelievable. They would stop. The next line would pass through while the second line would load. The second line would fire. The third line would pass through. It presented and fired. The first line was then ready to go forward. It fired. So the line was either always going forward or always coming back, like this. Nothing could stand for long in front of a battle line. 2 armies, Continental armies, one generally whipped the other in pretty doggone short order. They decimated them if they stayed there very long, so they made sure that the battles didn't last too long because it was terribly expensive as far as men were concerned. These soldiers weren't 10 soldiers. They were highly trained. And with the bayonets, they would go forward, and our colonists in Virginia certainly weren't skilled in bayonet fighting. We had our musket rifles, though. A musket rifle was accurate not at 50 yards like a battle line. It was accurate at 200 yards, or even further. But it took 1 full minute to load and patch that thing. And in the meantime, a musketeer could be on you. He would shoot at you and then run you through with a bayonet. So riflemen could never stand in front of a battle line. It was impossible. But things changed once they got in the woods. All of a sudden, there were lots of hiding places. And in order to keep people away from you, away from the battle line, you had light infantry go in front. The light infantry had the rifles. The light infantry would fight the light infantry in front and left the battle line alone until time was ready for it to move forward and do its thing. They also carried cannon. Now those cannon would make matchsticks of any fort in the West. All these palisaded forts that you see in these pictures wouldn't last a half an hour with a cannon outside pounding them to pieces if they could get that cannon to the fort, which was very difficult sometimes. Braddock started off. He knew all the answers. He wouldn't listen to General George Washington, and he put the Virginians in the rear. In other words, the light infantry were in the rear. They marched all the way up to the French forts. Their scouts came back and said they thought there was some enemy ahead, so he deployed into his battle lines. And they started on both sides of the road. And they started forward and lined the battle. Well, in front of them was a Frenchman. I've forgotten his name right now. But he said they were all planning to pull out. And everybody knew no one could stand in front of a British battle line. But he thought he'd give them a try. So he took his Indian allies and a few Frenchmen, and they went down and started taking pot shots. Well, the battle line presented arms and fired. Beauchambeau, that sounds like the French commander's name, he was killed in the first volley, and 5 or 6 other Frenchmen and 2 or 3 Indians were killed. And that was the only success the British battle line had that day. Everyone in front disappeared. The British battle line moved forward, there was nothing in front. But the rifle fire kept coming, and redcoats kept falling here, there, and yonder. They presented and fired, presented and fired, and presented and fired, and nothing was hit. But the redcoats kept following, so they started moving back to the road. And as they moved back, they started enveloping the flanks. And when that started happening, they started falling 10 at a time and 20 at a time. And then General Braddock became alarmed, and he said, we need light infantry up here to take care of these. So they called General Washington. General Washington came forward at a run from 2 miles in the rear. By that time, do you know what the Indians and the French had done to the British battle line? It had completely chewed it up. Washington got in between the British and the French while the British Army tried to withdraw and kept them at a distance. And the Indians went after the redcoats to wear them around. They loved the British redcoats, and that held them up for about an hour or two. And the Virginians lost dearly holding the French and Indians back. But that is the mode of warfare that they had. The Indians had few laws and no laws that were binding. Consequently, Indians had almost no enforceable contracts among themselves that were honored, much less with whites. The only things enforceable were enforceable with a rifled musket. Indians fought for booty, prestige among their own people, and to satisfy the demands of their guards. If one was to be their ally, he must acquiesce in what the Indians wanted, or they wouldn't fight. To make them fight, the French had to agree to let the Indians do as they liked, which included their offering sacrifices to their god Oki, or the same god with a different local name. There was little that could be done to stop it. The war progressed. It was a general war. The raiding parties came over the mountains, New England all the way to Georgia. There was constant smoke on the horizon. There were constant cries of pain as people were being offered to Oki. There were the Tories, those British American citizens who sided with the British. When the revolution came, they in turn formed alliance with the same Indians that the French had formed alliances with earlier. And that is what caused this tremendous hatred of the colonials against the Tories. The Tories accompanied the Indian war parties. And the colonists in Virginia and elsewhere considered the lowest form of life to be a Tory. And frankly, taken prisoners, when they were taken prisoners, more often than not, they wouldn't take the Tories prisoners if caught with an Indian war party. Things like this were happening. Butler's Tory Rangers took part in the Wyoming and Cherry Valley massacres in 1778. If you ran with the Indians, there was going to be a massacre when you met or you conquered. The Cherry Valley, New York massacre in particular was a very nasty scene. The village contained about 150 people and was attacked on November 11th by Walter Butler and Joseph Brant with 800 Indians and Tories. 1/3 of the Indians were killed, of the villagers were killed in the attack. Most of the rest were taken captive and slowly put to death in the most cruel and barbarous manner before reaching the Canadian settlements. And this is the story that we hear about this. It was a constant running battle. I'm having to push right ahead. You understand this? Frontier mercy. In 1781, a white man who had his tongue torn out and his hands cut off reached the settlement where he soon died. Elsewhere, a scout deep in the woods heard an explosion. Investigating, he found the bodies of 6 Indians and a white woman. She had been captured and kept by the chief for his own pleasure. To destroy the savages, she threw gunpowder into the fire, killing herself and all of the Indians. Footnote, this followed the example of Heber's wife, who took a nail and killed the Canaanite king, Judges 4, 1-24. The only way whites would take Indians captive was to ransom them for other whites held by either the Indians or the British. If they could not be used in this manner, they were killed. Colonel David Williamson turned Indian captives over to the commander of Fort Pitt to be exchanged. The Fort Pitt commander released them, and they began once more to prey on the border settlements. It sounds like the day of sentencing of criminals, doesn't it? Although it was the Fort Pitt's commander's fault, Colonel Williamson was held in public disgrace. To redeem himself, Williamson later used any pretext to kill Indians. The rule quoted and followed on the frontier was, "I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and thou shalt drive them out before thee. Thou shalt make no covenant with them. They shall not dwell in their land." Exodus 23:31 through 33. "Thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them." Deuteronomy 7:1 through 4. It was at this time the sign of Phineas came about. The sign of Phineas is merely a cross with the top made into a P. And that was posted to assure that anyone entering that area or that section, that God's law was to be enforced, and everyone came under God's law. Wherever an Indian massacre took place on the ground, often you would see rocks formed in the form of a cross with a P at the top. The sign of Phineas. We haven't seen that for many, many years in Virginia. The Indian fighter Simon Kenton often fought beside Lew Wetzel. Because of his reputation, he underwent horrible torture when captured. He was dragged by a wild horse through the woods, made to run the gauntlet 8 times. You know about the gauntlet. Turned over to the British, he escaped from their prison and went right back to the trade of killing Indians. Miraculously, he survived and became an old man in 1836. The most successful of all was Deathwind. Deathwind was an Indian warrior, an Indian fighter that surpassed anything that we have ever known. When I take my hikes into the mountains of Virginia, I go into the land of Deathwind. You feel it in those great Virginia oaks that other mighty men have been there before. You can see the old plantation roads that have trees like this growing on them. We know there were plantations, but before the time of plantations, other great men walked these glens and these hills. Lew Wetzel was the pedigree of this unusual man was usual for the period. His father was John Wetzel, a Swiss immigrant. They landed in Pennsylvania. Now, we divide our nation up into states. I think this is most unfortunate. They divided the nation up into geographic regions. You go to Pennsylvania and you move to the western part of Pennsylvania, you hit that district of land that shoots right straight through the western part of Virginia into the western part of North Carolina and Tennessee. It's easier to come from western Pennsylvania to Tennessee or western North Carolina than it is to go on further west, because you start running into big mountains in western Pennsylvania. So many of Pennsylvanians ended up right in Virginia. They were called Valley Germans. Lew Wetzel started his career. He was one of 6 children. He lived in Virginia, moved back to Pennsylvania, moved back to Virginia. He was one of them captured. Okay. One day, he and his brother Jacob were hoeing corn when they were suddenly fired upon by an Indian war party, hidden in the woods. You see, you never knew whether an Indian party were traders coming to trade or a war party. All they had to do was put on paint. Now, the paint was important. It meant things to them that we don't understand. They would put it on their face where it could be seen, or put it behind their ear, which could not be seen under their hair. And you didn't know whether that man was on the warpath or not on the warpath. It made it very difficult. So I'll tell you, it reached a point, if you saw an Indian you shot and worried about whether he was on the warpath or not, after you looked at him very carefully on the ground, you know. And if you determined that he was not on the warpath, you said, I'm sorry, and then, you know. Lewis was wounded, and both children were captured. They were so tightly bound that blood began to flow. They were watched carefully by their captors to see which of them was sensitive to pain, and whichever the one hurt the most, that was the one that was going to be selected as a sacrifice to Oki. The children were frontier-wise, and neither one showed any pain at all. And, you know, the Indians were disappointed. If they could feel pain, if they could not feel pain, Oki would not appreciate them as a sacrifice. It would have been a wasted motion, and Oki might even become insulted. So they were not offered. They were just kept as slaves. A few nights later, Lewis and his brother loosened their bonds and escaped. They took from the sleeping warriors their father's rifle, which had been stolen, his powder horn, and 2 pair of Indian moccasins to travel in. By the time Lewis was a teenager, he had moved long distances with and without his family, survived smallpox, which disfigured his face. He was pockmarked. Could play the violin wonderfully. I think of the kids last night. Though he never learned to read and write. Had been captured and escaped from the Indians, had witnessed countless massacres, and he was a product of his time. Almost every family had lost a member to the Indians, with the one lost often dying in excruciating pain. The conclusion was simple. The Indians caused pain. If there were no Indians, there would be no pain. How logical can you get? The government was fighting the Indians. Lewis made a vow which was known on the frontier, and it was this: I swear to kill every Indian that crosses my path so long as God lets me live. When Lou was 16, he joined a party attempting to regain loot taken by Indian raiders. He was in the lead, and he alone made contact with the 3 grown braves. An Indian warrior is a fearsome thing. He immediately treed. That meant he went behind a tree for cover. The Indians went behind their trees. Lou held his hat out. He held it out on a stick, and it was greeted with 3 bullets. Confident that they had killed him, the Indians exposed themselves when they sprang forward to collect his scalp as a trophy. Lou leaned from behind his tree and carefully sighted and killed the foremost Indian. Now listen here. Rifle empty. Now he was 16. Rifle empty, he sprang to his feet and ran off through the brush and through the trees, scampering down steep embankments and up steep hills on the other side and running through the briars and the bushes and everything. He managed to pour the correct amount of powder into his barrel, tamp it down. He managed to take a ball in his mouth, patch it, start it, take a ramrod and push it, all while he's scampering down hills and climbing up hills, ram that ball home on top of the powder, running at full speed. Indians were fast. They were fast. Running as fast as he could, he pulled the hammer back, opening the pan. He took his powder horn and he put powder in the powder pan. Then he slowed his run down, and the Indian started catching up. And then he twirled and shot the next Indian, and then he took off again. He is the only man I have ever known that could load a musket rifle on a run. I know it's a devil's own time to load it while you're standing still. But he did it on a full run with people behind him thirsting for his blood. He killed all 3, went back and took their scalps, hung them to his belt, and returned to the party. And he was welcomed as an adult would be welcome as a hero. Now, that was the birth of Lew Wetzel as a death wind. The word came out that there was someone special in the woods of Virginia. He would pick up an Indian war party, and this is when he was 17 or 18 years old. He would pick up a war party of 10 or 20, sometimes 5 or 6 other times, and he would hang on them, and they would chase him, and he would kill 2 or 3. And then he would go back and track the rest of them. And the Indians came to call him by the French name, Le Vent de la Mort, the wind of death. And he made a sound that I've never heard, and I can only imagine what it was. It was a mournful cry through the trees and through the forest, and the Indians would hear it, and they would put on this white paint of death. It meant death wind was in the woods of Virginia, and they would all die. It was inevitable. It was just a question of when. Lew Wetzel was a fearsome thing to the Indians. He was the shining example to the frontiersmen. But a lot of frontiersmen didn't know Lew Wetzel. To him, he was just another person. The big problem in Virginia was the Indians, but a bigger one was the renegades. The people with a nice smile, and the blonde hair, and the blue eyes, who would come in and tell horror stories about the Indians outside. And they would go to sleep at night, and they would open up the gates and let the Indians in to kill everyone in the settlement. It was the renegade that was the great problem in Virginia. And it got to the point that no one was ever welcome in any gathering or any settlement unless he had a sponsor. And if Lew Wetzel didn't have a sponsor in that town, or no one knew him, he was treated like everyone else, which meant he was bound and kept. And if a sponsor did not come forward in a reasonable period of time, he was killed. The story of Lew Wetzel goes on and on and on. There are countless examples, countless exploits where he took entire Indian war parties coming from Kentucky into Virginia. In his lifetime, he killed over 2,000 Indians by himself. He cleared out the western part of Virginia and made it safe. He let his hair grow all the way to the ground. He said if the Indians ever get a trophy, he was going to give them a good one. But they never took his scalp. He later went to New Orleans and came back to Tennessee. And while back there, he died. If I remember right, he was about 185 pounds, about 5'10", very erect, friendly, quiet. And he was looked on as the hero to be emulated on the frontier. Lew Wetzel, Phineas Priest, Le Vent de la Mort, Death Wind. Thank you.